Shalom, everyone. This is the first installment of what I hope will be a weekly shiur that I will send out to the entire congregation, a brief shiur. This one will be on Parshat Hashvua, and I hope to be able to send out at least one of these per week that you could open up on your own time and perhaps engage in the study of the upcoming Parsha. We'll see how it goes, and I welcome your feedback as to what your thoughts are in terms of the content of the shiur, in terms of the delivery method, or any other suggestions you may have. This Shabbat, we are going to read Parshat Noach. A lot happens in Parshat Noach. Leading up to the flood, we're told about the terrible behavior of the entire human race. And then we have the story of Noach building the ark and life on the boat and who was on the boat and what was on the boat. I would like to focus for a few minutes on what happened when Noach came off of the boat and see what we could learn from what he did. So let's start with some of the psukim that teach about what happened after Noach, or when Noach is commanded to leave the boat. If you'd like to follow along in a chumash, this is in Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, chapter 8, Perek Chet. I'm starting with Pasuk Tet Vav, verse 15. I'll read the psukim in Hebrew, and I will translate them into English as well. Here is what God says. Vayidaber Elohim el Noach lemor. God says to Noach, Tzei min hateva, ata v'ishtecha uvanecha u'neshevanecha itach. Come out of the ark together with your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives. Kol hachaya asher itcha mikol basar ba'of v'haima v'chol ha'remes ha'romes al ha'aretz hayitzei itach v'shartzu ba'aretz ufaru v'ravu al ha'aretz. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds, animals, and everything that creeps on the earth, and let them swarm on the earth, and be fertile and increase on earth. Kol hachaya, kol haremes, v'chol ha'of, kol romes al ha'aretz, mishbechotehem yatzu min hateva. So Noah came out. I skipped the pasuk. Vayetze Noach ubanav v'ishto u'neshev banav ito. So Noah came out together with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. Every animal, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that stirs on the earth came out of the ark by the families. So that is the narration of what happened. As soon as the flood ended, God tells Noah to come out of the boat. The very first thing that Noah does after the flood comes next. Do you know what the very first thing that Noah does after the flood? The very first thing that Noah does after the flood is he builds a mizbeach. He builds a altar to Hashem, and he brings karbanot. He brings sacrifices to Hashem. So let's read those psukim. Continue with verse 20. Vayiven Noach mizbeach l'Hashem vayikach mikol habehema haTorah umikol ha'of haTahor vayal olot b'mizbeach. Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking of every clean animal and of every clean bird, he offered burnt offerings on the altar. Vayar Hashem et reach hanichoach. And now we have God's reaction. God Hashem et reach hanichoach. God smelled the pleasing odor. Vayomer Hashem el libo lo osif lekalel od et ha'adama ba'avor hadam ki yitzer lev hadam ramin urav lo osif od lahakot et kol Chai kasher asiti. Never again will I doom the earth because of man, since the devisings of man's minds are evil from his youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living being that I have ever done. So, in this case, Noach builds an altar. He then brings a karban, and immediately he is blessed with a nevuah. Immediately he is blessed with a prophecy from Hashem. So I'd like to focus for a few minutes on the commentary of Ralbag and what he learns from this episode. The first thing the Ralbag reminds us is something that Maimonides, that Rambam said about how God directs us to serve him. And here, the Rambam teaches us a very important yesod, a very important principle in terms of how God directed Bnei Israel to serve him. What the Rambam says, and he says this in part 3 of the Moreh Nevuchim, part 3 of the Guide to the Perplexed, chapter 32. I'm going to read you in English what he says. It's actually very fascinating, and in its own right is worthy of consideration and thought, and maybe this will be something you think about after listening to this class. Maimonides says as follows: many precepts in our law are the result of a similar course adopted by the Supreme Being. What's that course? It is namely impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to the other. It is therefore, according to the nature of man, impossible for him to suddenly discontinue everything to which he has been accustomed. So the Rambam here is saying going cold turkey doesn't work. So maybe if the Rambam was giving advice on how to stop smoking, he would not recommend going cold turkey. But the Rambam says it's impossible for a person to stop doing something they've been doing their whole life and to all of a sudden change courses. So what does the Rambam recommend? Now, God sent Moses to make the Israelites a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So how is Moshe going to go about doing that? So instead of God telling the Jewish people, forget everything you've seen up to now in terms of how the surrounding nations serve God, forget that entirely. Maimonides, don't forget that entirely, he says. Maimonides continues, the Israelites were commanded to devote themselves to his service, but the custom which was in those days general among all men, and the general mode of worship in which the Israelites were brought up, namely in Egypt, consisted in sacrificing animals in those temples which contained certain images, to bow down to those images, and to burn incense before them. It was in accordance with the wisdom and the plan of God that he did not command us to give up and to discontinue all these manners of service, for to obey such a commandment it would have been contrary to the nature of man, who generally cleaves to that which he is used to. So therefore, Maimonides continues, what did God do? God said, instead of not bringing incense, instead of not bringing sacrifices, instead of not building temples, which all the surrounding nations did to idols, to foreign gods, God said, do all those things. Burn incense, bring sacrifices, build temples, but do all of them for me. The masses, Maimonides argues, would have been unable to totally stop and move on to a completely new mode of worship. So therefore, God says, instead of asking the masses to do that which was impossible, he says, to direct that same type of service towards God. And Maimonides concludes, by this divine plan it was effected that the traces of idolatry were blotted out, and truly great principle of our faith, the existence and unity of God, was firmly established. This result was obtained without deterring or confusing the minds of the people by the abolition of the service to which they were accustomed and which alone was familiar to them. So God essentially says, I'm going to work for the strengths of Bnei Israel. This is what they know. This is what they're accustomed to. I'm going to now give them the opportunity to direct it towards me, and I will abolish idol worship that way. So that is an introduction, and I think really, really important, and we'll get back to how we can apply that to our own lives in a minute. But essentially the Rambam is saying that God never asked Bnei Israel to do something which which would have required a sort of 180 complete change. Of course, rather, he channels what they already know to the service of God. The Rambam likes that very much, does not disagree, but asks a question. He says, that is true when it comes to the masses. But what about Abraham and Moshe and Noach, who were the greatest people in our tradition, who seemingly would have had the ability to change course? Why did they also bring sacrifices? Why did they also serve God the way that other individuals and nations served their foreign gods? It would seem that God could ask a little bit more of Abraham. He could ask a little bit more of Noach. He could ask a little bit more of Moshe, as opposed to what we know was not possible with the masses. So one answer to the Rambam's question is no. People are people. Even if you're a great person like Abraham, a great person like Noach and Moshe, you do not have the ability to go against your nature, to go against what you've become accustomed to. And so God treats Abraham, Moshe, and Noach the same way he treats Bnei Israel. That's one approach, and I think it's a legitimate approach. The Ralbag has a different approach. The Ralbag says it is true. that Noach and Moshe and Abraham, they were great, and they certainly had the ability to change course, unlike the masses. If that's the case, why did God ask them also to bring sacrifices? And the Ralbag's answer essentially is that sacrifices, besides the purpose they serve for the masses, serve a separate purpose, which is to prepare a person for nevuah, for prophecy. To prepare an individual for prophecy. And his proof is, the Ralbag goes through a number of times in the Torah and in the Tanakh, that right after a person brought a sacrifice, they are given a prophecy. So that's a second yesod, a second important principle that we've learned here now. That is, there's a connection, according to the Ralbag, between sacrifice and prophecy. That in order to achieve prophecy, one has to bring a sacrifice. The proof that the Ralbag brings in this parsha are the psukim that I read to you. From Noach, Noah comes off the teva, comes off the ark. The first thing he does is build an altar, and after he builds the altar, he brings sacrifices. And right after he brings sacrifices, immediately he's given the prophecy that there's not going to be a flood that's going to destroy the world anymore. The Ralbag is left with one other question to answer, and that is why? Why does one have to bring a sacrifice in order to be given prophecy? And he says that the answer is as follows. That prophecy requires two things. First of all, it requires mental focus of the seichel, and it also requires the quieting of our emotions, the quieting of some of our animal or human emotions. And says the Ralbag, that is achieved through a sacrifice. Because when someone sacrifices the animal, kills the animal, cuts up the animal, one is immediately struck with the temporary nature of things physical. We sort of quiet our animal nature and realize that all of our animal instincts and our physical instincts, they're important, but they're not the be-all and end-all of existence, because they are not going to exist forever. And then that gives rise to a intellectual consideration of the important things in life, and that heightens our seichel, heightens our intellectual considerations and pursuits. Once a person does that, then they are able to achieve prophecy. And so that is why, according to the Ralbag, even great individuals like Noach, who did not need to be weaned away from idol worship like the masses, nonetheless were still commanded to bring sacrifices. So what we have in this brief shiur are three important principles of Jewish life. One, the principle that the Rambam brings, and that is that sometimes education is best achieved by channeling what we are accustomed to and channeling our strengths. God decided not to force Bnei Yisrael to engage in a completely new type of offering, a new type of religious experience, but rather to channel that which they were used to from seeing the surrounding nations that they had been engaged with, most notably Mitzrayim. And maybe that could remind us in our own lives, instead of trying to find completely new ways to serve God, we can find things that we're accustomed to doing, things that we like doing, and simply try to channel those towards the service of God, sometimes even recognize that they are the service of God. Also reminds us about our children. Instead of perhaps trying to completely remake our children, maybe we can channel some of their energies, which sometimes may manifest themselves in ways which are not necessarily always positive. We could channel those to positive directions and to directions that fall into the rubric of Avodat Hashem, the rubric of service of God. So that's one important yesod, one important basic principle that the Rambam teaches about how God views our service and perhaps how we can apply that principle to our life. Another important yesod, another important principle that we learn from the Ralbag is that a sacrifice in the Tanakh, sacrifice is needed in order to help us achieve the goal of prophecy. That one of the things that God did in order to help people achieve prophecy is to give them the opportunity to sort of lower the heat, if you will, on our animal-human emotions and lift up our intellectual pursuits, if you will, and that will enable us to achieve prophecy. And Ralbag proves that by showing that many times in Tanakh there were episodes of sacrifice which were immediately followed by prophecy. And so those are some of the basic principles that we learn from Noach coming off the Teva, off the ark, and the first thing that he is told to do is to build an altar and bring sacrifices. It also reminds us of the importance of an idea. The third yesod is the principle that we learn is what sacrifices teach us. Sacrifices teach us that all things physical are temporary, and that ultimately what has lasting significance are things spiritual, are the relationships we build with Hashem, the relationships we build with other people. And by seeing the destruction of the animal, if you will, we're reminded about, again, the temporary nature of those physical things and the importance of our intellectual and spiritual pursuits. So this it brings us to the end of this first shiur, 16 minutes and 30 seconds. I'd like to hear your thoughts about all aspects of it again. I thank you for watching it, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Shalom.